The most common narrative of the Vietnam War is that of failure. From the American perspective, it is imposing American imperialism in a third world country that didn't want anything to do with it. The war was continuing an unjustified conflict with a country of innocent farmers fighting for freedom, more for American influence than anything else. In the end, 4 million Vietnamese and Americans lay dead in the ruined country. And this war would only be the first of many wars like it. A series of proxy wars to impose American imperialism on the rest of the world due to paranoid fear of communism or for economic reasons. For the Vietnamese, the war is one of independence. It was fighting off 4 Chinese occupations. Then, it was the occupation of the French starting 200 years ago, where incompetent French colonizers crippled the Vietnamese economy to grow rubber and coffee instead of rice. Decades of uprisings from the communists, nationalists, the Great Viet rebel groups were brutally shut down by the French, and it finally culminated in total victory against Western imperialism. 2,000 years against the Chinese, 200 against the French, and 20 against the Americans. This war was winning at long last. These interpretations of events fit the narrative of the academics participating in the anti-war marches, as well as the communist victors of the war, the image of an American versus Vietnamese war. However, this view of the war of the United States against Vietnam is not quite correct, because there was one last perspective, a Vietnam free just the same, but free in a different way. Free like the Republic of Korea, the Republic of China, and the Federal Republic of Germany. This view has been limited and has failed to be told in the mainstream because this side lost, and history is told by the victors. The same anti-war academics, today's professors, have primarily controlled the narrative of the war. But this view is one of Vietnamese versus Vietnamese, and it belongs to the Viet Kieu, or Vietnamese exiles. The war started November 1st, 1955, and ended 30th April, 1975. The first American Marines landed on Vietnamese shores in 1965, after the Tonkin Incident, and the last American troops ceased combat in 1971 and completely left early 1973. The narrative of an American versus Vietnamese war typically focuses on the American politics during the other points in time. This is because it avoids talking about the actions on the front lines. Cherry picking. At these points in time, the Vietnamese were fighting the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese exiles used to be called the Republic of Vietnam. Contrary to the mainstream analysis, or mere dismissal of, the Republic of Vietnam was not an insignificant portion of the country and not simply useless American puppets. When the Chinese, Soviets, and French split the country in half, those who supported communism went north, and those who opposed it went south. There was a 300-day period where people were allowed to move between the two countries. Nobody expected it to turn into a massive migration of hundreds of thousands of people afraid of communism. About 250,000 went north, and up to 1 million headed south. Many were Catholics who feared persecution by the communists. Many others saw exactly who the communists were when the landlords, the educated, and the fortunate were persecuted, tortured, and had their possessions stripped from them. Rough modern estimates put the murdered at 15,000. But the two Vietnams by this point were two different countries. They had the same Vietnamese peoples and language, but different ideologies. Most of the Western material analyzing the war is focused on the American involvement. The Tet Offensive of 1968 always takes center stage as the turning point of the war, the event that tipped over public support for American intervention by shattering the delusion that the war was being won. How could the communists organize such a massive scale offensive? The analysis comes to this conclusion. The fact that the insurgents could mount such a large offensive simply means the US government lied about their capabilities and was not in fact winning. Then, it analyzes the Battle of Hue and Khe Sanh in a lot of detail. However, the overall military analysis tells a slightly different story. But first, the political situation in the North's Politburo must be understood. The communist leadership had promised the Northerners that they would be able to fight for 20 more years, but in fact it was severely split. After direct American intervention, the insurgency was severely losing ground. Nguyen, the northern general known in the West as the architect of the offensives, actually protested against the offensive. Both he and Ho Chi Minh were by then figureheads, and both of them took sick leaves to Hungary in passive protest. American bombing and search and destroy missions had taken their toll. Southern communists admit after the war that the pacification programs had severely weakened their ranks. In addition, Vietcong and NVA forces took massive casualties compared to that of their Southern and American counterparts. In the year before the Tet Offensive, 2 of the 3 major communist forward positions, the Iron Triangle and Warzone C, were lost with massive casualties. For example, during Operation Cedar Falls to destroy the Iron Triangle in 1967, the communists lost about 10 times their capitalist counterparts. This is true for most battles throughout the entire war. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nguyen, decided on more drastic actions. In one massive attack, the communists decided a display of determination and power would persuade the southern civilians and soldiers to revolt against their government. In essence, a last-ditch effort. And on January 30th, 80,000 troops simultaneously assaulted 100 towns and villages, almost all provincial capitals, Khe Sanh, Hue, and Saigon. The footage showed a complete all-out attack. A supposedly defeated army has now mounted an impossible offensive in the face of an American victory. Therefore, that victory was a lie. And that's where most contemporary analysis of the war ends. Pictures and images of the brutality and horror of war reached the unknowing civilians in the United States. It sparked anti-war protests and the realization that the government had lied. But a deeper military analysis presents a different picture altogether. That it was a complete and utter military disaster for the communists. Within days, even hours, the vast majority of the smaller attacks, typically executed by battalion-sized units, were completely driven out. Mostly by South Vietnamese soldiers, not American, since the attacks hit South Vietnamese towns and provincial capitals, rather than the fire support bases where American troops were deployed. Khe Sanh base being the largest exception. However, its strategic value and importance is driven slightly out of proportion. It is actually one of many FSBs all around I Corps. The National Liberation Front dedicated 300 to 500,000 troops to this offensive. 4 years later in the Easter Offensive, only about 10 to 20,000 out of that number could even participate. But the severe losses in manpower was not the only failure of the Tet Offensive. When the Vietcong attacked, they revealed exactly where their staging areas, supply dumps, forward base areas, and logistics routes were. When that happened, these positions were thoroughly destroyed by American and Southern counterattacks. The entire VC organization and its logistics chain was at this point shattered. The Tet Offensive was such a disaster that the Central Office for South Vietnam, the North's headquarters in the South, drafted Resolution 55 with the words, "Never again, and under no circumstances are we going to risk our entire military force for just an offensive." Unfortunately, it would be public sentiment in the US that led to its troops' withdrawal. The images and footage coming out of the Tet Offensive, a scandal from the My Lai massacre, revelations involving an expanded war in Cambodia, and later on the Pentagon Papers, would cement opposition to continuing the war. And the international propaganda apparatus of the North painted a picture of itself as a united Vietnamese people fighting against a weak puppet government and the oppression of the United States. Ironically enough, with the Vietcong almost being wiped out, the DMZ now clearly defined the two countries. All further military offensives and action required the North to send down its own troops, rather than growing support native in the South. The communists had suffered a severe military defeat, but they could see that if they waited several years, the Americans might be gone. After the Tet Offensive, contemporary Western analyses of the war, with Carnot, Ken Burns' The Vietnam War, and Vietnam, A Television History as the prime examples, start to emphasize heavily on the American politics in the White House and in Saigon. All of these sources skim over the next massive offensive, the Easter Offensive of 1972. It is important to understand the sheer scale of the Easter Offensive. The People's Army of Vietnam, the Army of the North, committed 10 out of its 11 infantry divisions, along with around 500 to 1,000 Soviet-made modern T-54 main battle tanks and amphibious PT-76 light tanks, 122mm and 130mm artillery guns, 122mm rockets, state-of-the-art AT-3 Sager guided anti-tank missiles and SA-7 shoulder-launched guided anti-aircraft missiles, along with copious amounts of recoilless rifles, mortars, and 37mm anti-aircraft emplacements, all supported by a pipeline that ran straight up to the DMZ and even a little into the Ho Chi Minh Trail to fuel it all. The North Vietnamese army was not a bunch of decently armed farmers, but excellently equipped and well-trained soldiers. The Soviet Union itself offered advanced armor training to 3,000 NBA tank crews for the new equipment. The communists completely changed the style of warfare that they were waging from that of a guerrilla insurgency war to that of a modern, combined arms maneuver war. It was not a large number of rather insignificant attacks, but rather 3 corps-level offensives with dedicated armored units, artillery formations, and anti-aircraft batteries. The fighting was, by this point, very much unlike the Vietnam War commonly ingrained in public memory, but rather another Korean War, or Second World War. The Easter Offensive was the largest conventional invasion since North Korea invaded South Korea, involving roughly 200 to 300,000 northern soldiers, which is almost as much as the 330,000 that attacked just 4 years earlier. And they aimed it for when the number of American soldiers would be at its lowest point. What was around 600,000 soldiers in 1968 was now 158,000 in 1971, and then 24,000 at the end of 1972, the vast majority of whom belonged to logistics. But the North's military capability is not the intended takeaway of the Easter Offensive. What's important is that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam stood its ground. In I Corps, the recently constituted 3rd Division was bombarded by massive amounts of artillery and broke and fled in the face of armor. The Marines left over on their western flank were pushed back by the 3 NVA divisions and independent regiments, losing Quang Tri 1 month in. But those Marines, in Operation Lam Son 7-2, spearheaded by the Airborne Division, returned to the city they lost and brutally fought house to house, hand to hand, and hunted down as many tanks as they could with laws for 2 months, and finally retook the city. It was brutal to the point that in the official northern history, they sent in a company's worth of men into the city every day, and even that was not enough. All of their battalions had been reduced to 50 to 60 out of a typical 300 to 500 men. Artillery from the north and airstrikes from the Americans was so fierce that every couple of meters was another shell hole. That was just in I Corps. In II Corps, the North managed to destroy the 22nd ARVN Division at Tân Can, then surround the 23rd at Con Tum with yet another 3 divisions. The PAVN's ground equipment completely outclassed the ARVN's. The M41 light tank could not even compare to the T-54, and the 122 to 130mm guns had triple the range of ARVN's 105mm. In III Corps, the 5th ARVN Division was completely surrounded and cut off from supplies by 3 divisions as well. They had to be resupplied by air. In both these cases, B-52 arc light strikes had to be used to annihilate the North's infantry before they could attack. And that is what a lot of these consumer documentaries tend to state briefly, that American air power made the difference. This is true, but it simplifies the action to the point of inaccuracy. The infantry is the only unit that fulfills all tactical requirements required by all militaries. It is the only unit able to hold buildings and cities and effectively fortify these positions against armored and infantry assaults. It is the only unit able to chase down T-54s that manage to punch holes through the front lines or fight house to house, hand to hand for every single block of An Lop, Con Tum, or Quang Tri. It is the only unit capable of holding back the enemy and pinning them on the spot for the next arc flight to land. These are all tactical requirements that no amount of airstrikes will ever be able to fulfill alone. When the mainstream narrative says simply, American air power made the difference, it neglects the nature of modern combined arms warfare. Yes, American air power made the difference, but that difference could never have meant anything without the infantry. That infantry was made up of the soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. In Stanley Carnell's Vietnam, A History, this militarily significant offensive is given only about 6 pages. The same thing is seen in Ken Burns' The Vietnam War. The Easter Offensive is relegated only about 10 minutes out of an hour and 50 minutes screen time for that specific episode. Vietnam, A Television History, is only slightly better. All of them skim over the strategic level, not to even mention the operational level of the fighting. Lam Son 7-2, the operation involving 3 divisions to retake Quang Tri, is not even mentioned. The remaining screen time is primarily politics, with a particular emphasis on anti-war perspectives. Unfortunately, the American academics and journalists tend to skim over this period in time. However, the American advisors working directly with their Vietnamese comrades, be it airborne, marine, ranger, or regular army, all say something completely different. Of course, some advisors happen to be unfortunate enough to be deployed with newer, less experienced units, like the 3rd Division or the 22nd, but many others praised the men in the units who stood their ground and fought with them. Together with their advisors, the men of ARVN managed to hold back the Easter Offensive. After the offensive was the peace accord. Media often portray Nguyen as incompetent, power-hungry, and corrupt. This is correct. He is to blame for many of the problems of the South, especially installing generals for personal ties rather than merit. However, there is one matter in which he was very correct, and that is the Paris Peace Agreement of 1973. Kissinger had made the concession to the North that they could keep their soldiers in the South and Cambodia. Thieu absolutely tried to refuse to sign the agreement due to this one point. The modern media almost portrayed Thieu as a petulant child resisting, but that's because, again, they do not understand the military situation. Although severely wounded in the Easter Offensive, the North had gained footholds in many of the corps. In addition, reinforcements were still going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bringing many of the 10 divisions the North had down in the South back to operational strength. For the American politicians to allow the North to keep their supply line and foothold like this was a death sentence to the South. Due to the shape of South Vietnam, any attack could cut the country in half, and any attack would be within a stone's throw of a provincial capital. The fact is that South Vietnam had a 1,700 kilometer long border to defend and was very thin. That means that if its border is punctured, there is no follow-up terrain to which the South could fall back to. The Southern Army only had its front lines, and right behind that were the major cities, then ocean. And allowing the North to keep its invasion force ready to attack at any location along this border was leaving knives at South Vietnam's throat. But Nixon had promised swift and severe action should the North break this agreement, and Thieu signed the accord. In 1975, that cut fell. When the North replenished its troops, it attacked Phu Clom to test the Americans. When no American aid came, it took Ban Mae Thuột. Southern forces in the area were ordered to retreat along Route 7, and this turned into a disaster. The civilians, seeing the soldiers leaving, panicked and ran too. Military trucks and civilian vehicles completely clogged the road. Food and water ran out almost instantaneously, and at this crucial moment, PAVN bombarded the column, slaughtering thousands of civilians and soldiers. Thieu then ordered the abandonment of the Central Highlands to retreat into Tactical Zones 3 and 4. Highway 1 along the coast would be used for this retreat. Theoretically, this was a sound decision because it concentrated ARVN's forces in a smaller area, with defensive layers stopping the communist advance. However, the reality on the ground meant that such a maneuver was impossible. This would require a retreat under fire, which even for the best militaries in the world is an extremely difficult maneuver. There is an extremely thin line stopping it from becoming a rout. Ngo Quang, considered to be the best general the South has ever produced, argued against this maneuver. If his men could hold against the North in 1972 at their current locations, then they could hold it now. Thieu, giving Ngo conflicting orders, and doing public broadcasts conflicting even those orders, caused the civilians to panic and flee toward Da Nang. Highway 1 was clogged with 1 million civilians and vehicles, just like on Route 7. Again, PAVN bombarded the highways. The 1st Division, considered to be one of the best divisions the South could muster, disintegrated completely, while not even fighting the enemy. The Marines and Airborne could only partially manage to escape to Saigon. The situation in Thieu Corps was pretty much the same. Only the 22nd Division managed to make it out with any significant number of men. The logistics situation must be reviewed for this period in time. Many documentaries show images and footage of massive amounts of material in the forms of trucks, planes, and guns being transferred to South Vietnam. This portrays an image of ARVN being bountifully supplied. Again, the important details are glossed over, especially American versus Soviet weapons development. The US military primarily focused on its air power, due to its ability to deliver ordnance directly and safely. The Soviet Union, instead, invested in ground-based weaponry, especially artillery. Artillery is only accurate when there are ground teams in sight of the target, guiding and adjusting their artillery teams, which means those teams are put in serious risk. Air power is superior to artillery when it comes to delivery of ordnance, except in one area: cost. To maintain an air force, each aircraft must have trained pilots and ground crew, ammunition, spare parts, and large amounts of fuel. This is quite expensive, but the US has the economic ability to support an air force, something its ally definitely could not. While the arrays of aircraft look spectacular, the Vietnam Air Force simply didn't have the trained men to man them, the time and money to develop the necessary programs, or the fuel to put enough of them in the sky. And with Congress's cuts in aid, ammunition started to run out. The South's Joint General Staff rationed the artillery to only 2 to 4 shells a day. Each soldier was given 2 grenades and 80 M16 rounds a week. The fighting became so fierce to the point that equipment couldn't be repaired when it was damaged, due to the spare parts being completely used up. Only 20% of the trucks would be in operable condition, which meant men and supplies could not be transported. In a combined arms military, a failing logistics system is a death blow. No modern military can survive without fuel and ammo. Without American air power, the North's cheaper yet more abundant ground weaponry had a staying power that the Southern ground equipment could not compete with. It is the fighting in 3 Corps and 4 Corps that showed the Southern soldiers' determination. In the American media, the Fall of Saigon is portrayed as immediate. ARVN units simply abandoned their posts and the North rolled right in. This cannot be further from the truth. The action around Saigon is some of the most desperate fighting in the entire war, especially at Xuan Lop. The 18th Division was hit hard by an entire Northern Corps, or 3 divisions, supported by T-54s and thousands of artillery shells. The entire city was flattened, the division surrounded, and attacks came from 3 sides. Even then, the 18th held fast, fighting for every inch of ground, as armored forces desperately came from the west and the airborne 1st Brigade came from the south to rescue them. But after that, the 18th, battered from the battle, maneuvered to the newly reinforced line at Bien Hoa to guard the eastern approach to the capital. The 5th guarded the north, and the 25th the west, both of which had been fighting since the start of the offensive. The 22nd had arrived from 2 Corps and was placed to the south. Ranger units would be placed all around this new ring. Against them would be 5 corps of 14 divisions, plus 10 independent regiments and brigades. Not to mention that 13,000 more rounds of 130mm shells arrived, which had recently been delivered by the Soviets. While the US wiped its hands clean of its involvement, the Soviets and Chinese continued to send its full support. The North is still the same excellently equipped force as it was in '72. On the 26th of April, all PAVN units attacked at once, hitting the ring hard and piercing it in several areas, but the remaining ARVN units fought desperately for every single inch on all sides. The 6th Marines held out against elements of the 341st Division extremely fiercely at Ho Nai, often waiting for the PAVN tanks and soldiers to get within point-blank range before firing airburst artillery. Or the 81st Airborne Rangers at Tan Son Nhut, considered the single best unit in the entirety of ARVN, repelled twin armored columns of 27 T-54s and 21 K-63s, destroying 6 tanks and pushing back the infantry, all within 10 minutes of contact. For all the other locations on the ring, in the outer suburbs, fierce close-range urban combat was starting to break out. It was clear at this point that the fight for Saigon would be an absolute bloodbath. PAVN would have to fight for every yard of ground they gained in the city. The commander of the 304th Division stated as such. Then, the leadership surrendered. Maybe out of fear, or maybe to prevent this bloodbath, if not both. The Western journalists who documented this period in time primarily covered the evacuation at the embassy, simply because it was at the center of the city, near these journalists' hotels. They were nowhere near the defensive ring at Bien Hoa, Bình Dương, and Tan Son Nhut. The image that they saw of a peaceful takeover is due to the surrender. The action at the front lines say otherwise. But this is the prevailing image of an immediate collapse and of soldiers simply running away without a fight. There is an exception from the Associated Press. A reporter who was at Tan Son Nhut airport instead of the embassy saw the fighting, and he has a different story to tell. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam did not simply fall apart. Whole units and formations fought extremely bitter battles against the People's Army of Vietnam. Many of the weaker or newer units panicked and abandoned their posts, but many others also seized back territory in 1972 or fought to the death in 1975. Unfortunately, the desertions and routes came from one fact, and that is that the soldiers' families were typically living near the bases where the soldiers were destroyed. At the first sign of defeat, these men would drop everything and try to protect their families. We didn't have an America and family back home to return to. American dead never exceeded Southern dead during any year of the war. At no point in this war did the South ever hand over all defense to the Americans. We were fighting alongside them or alone to the end of the war. And when that army was destroyed, the only thing left was imprisonment and hard labor. Tens of thousands would die in those re-education camps, of a total of 300,000 that spent time there. These anti-war, stoned, comfortable, and safe activists did not fight for peace. They fought for 800,000 fleeing into the ocean and reaching other countries, and another 250,000 to 400,000 drowning at sea trying. They fought for the South's military cemetery being bulldozed over, and a sign that said, "Here lie the Americans' puppet soldiers who have paid the price for their crimes." They fought for the Northerners completely barring Southern families from grieving and paying respects to their dead sons, fathers, and brothers. There is another impression that the boat people were refugees escaping the war. However, the largest influx of refugees came in 1979, 4 years after the war ended. The South fought the war for 20 long years, long before American combat troops entered, and continued fighting the war through 2 major offensives even after those combat troops left. The Southern people did not abandon the country when it needed us the most in those 20 years, as long as we had the ammunition and rifles to fight. Only when supplies ran out, the American promise for swift and severe retaliatory action was broken, and the front line shattered, did the people run. We are not war refugees. We are political refugees. The war was not just a Vietnam versus American war, but also a Vietnam versus Vietnam war.